All right. And as you see, our title is John N. Smith Cemetery, The Family Connection. And as we talk about John Smith Cemetery and some of the people interred there, I'll talk a bit about their lives and how they are connected as family. That's one of the things that I'd like to point out to you. All right. Next. Okay. The cemetery is named for John N. Smith, who was thought to be the first person buried in the cemetery. Unfortunately, not much is known about John Smith. We only know that we do know, in fact, that he was born in 1840 and died in 1874 at the age of 34. Okay. Whitfield Griffin, one of the founding members not yet, Bob. Whitfield Griffin, one of the founding members of what is now Mount Carmel AME Church, along with Henry Hankins and Whitfield Griffin's wife, they donated 2 acres of the land for the Black population so that they would have a place to bury the dead. The land was given to the 5 Black churches which now exist in Southport, what is now Southport, for those residents. Over the years, representatives of the 5 Black churches have formed committees to take care of the property where the cemetery is. However, in recent times, the cemetery fell into disrepair, and this is when the John N. Smith Cemetery Restoration and Preservation Incorporate Committee, so to speak, a committee was formed, and they were formed to address the needs of the cemetery because it had fallen into such disrepair. Many of the earlier graves were marked with wooden blocks, sometimes even railroad ties, field stone cut by amateur stonemakers. And as you can imagine, even cinder blocks, over time, all of this degraded. So a lot of the graves were not marked. And one way that they could tell there might have been a grave there was simply by the planting of a flower or some kind of tree. Also, because we live in such a sandy area, the soil often sunk. You know, there were wooden boxes. There was no embalming at the time for some of the people. So you would see the land where the land had caved in, that this was an indication that there might have been someone interred there. Okay. Next slide. In 2011, to assist in the identification of some of the graves and where people had been interred, the committee asked Chrissy Judith and her canine Gypsy and John Ware and his canine Storm to help locate some of the graves. And the cadaver dogs located approximately a little over 100 graves that were in the cemetery. This search, let's see. Excuse me. And what they did was they marked the graves with small metal flags so that we'd have some indication of where they might be. And then with the use of GPS, they generated a map to show where some of the graves had been. Okay? Next. In recent times, in 2014, in fact, before 2014 and 2017, the committee got in touch with Owen Gidlow. And Owen Gidlow is a surveyor, and he is the one who helped to find over 1,200 of the graves that were unmarked. So we had about 1,700 graves in the cemetery, but about 1,200 were still unmarked. And with his ground penetrating equipment, he was able to identify where people had been buried. Okay. And as I said, the majority of them had been in unmarked graves. And over time, as people died and people left, of course, the cemetery was not cared for as it had been in earlier days. Okay. And he also surveyed the property at that time. Okay. Next. This is when John Smith opened its outdoor museum, and this was one of the flyers from the outdoor museum. The committee was able to erect tabletops that in some of the family plots that gave information about certain people that were buried there. So we invited the public, and it was quite a crowd, invited the public to come, and certain people were stationed in family areas to tell about those that were interred in that area. And this was our last mayor, Mayor Hayden, as he's cutting the ribbon for the ceremony to begin the tour. Okay. Next. Now I'm going to give you some of the family members that are family connections and family people that are interred in John Smith. This was Gib Davis Sr., and this appeared in the Stateport Pilot in The Way It Was. If you're familiar with The Way It Was, it's usually on one of the back pages, and they were asking, do you know this man? Well, I don't know who had identified him, but this is Gib Davis, and he was, Gib was at the ceremony when the Union Army took over Southport with Lieutenant Cushing. Lieutenant Cushing came in, and the Union Army took over Southport at Fort Fisher. And if you're not familiar with Fort Fisher, that's where the Welcome Center is in Southport now. So the old garrison, I think is what we used to call it when I was coming up. It was the garrison area. Now, Gib Davis, as a side, he actually looks like my cousin Tony Davis. If you know Tony, Tim, you would agree that you see the features. So I might have known him had I seen this, even though I, of course, had never met him. But his son was Elmer Davis. And Elmer Davis owned an establishment on the corner of St. George and Caswell Street. It was called the Cafe. At least we called it the Cafe. And you could go in and buy Johnny cakes, which were about this size for a penny. And he had pickled pig feet and what do you call those? Dill pickles and lots of candy, what we call squirrel nuts and all kinds of things there. And Elma Davis's wife was Maverick Gore. And she ran the back of the cafe where they fried chicken and sold dinners and things of that nature. We even had dances there from time to time. But on the corner of that street now, the cafe is gone, but the house of his great-great-grandson is there now, which is Reverend Tim Davis lives there. Okay? All right. Next. This is Abraham Galloway, not to be, but we refer to him as Abram Galloway because there was some confusion about if he was the abolitionist Abraham Galloway. He was not, as you can see by the date. So he uses used the name Abram to dispel that confusion. And Abram Galloway was a dray operator. And if you're not familiar with a dray, it's that flat wagon with the wheels on it. But basically, he was a junk man and a Civil War veteran, a waterman, and chairman of the Republican Party, as you can see here. Most of the men in Southport in the earlier days were Menhaden fishermen. So when you see anything about the water, they were fishermen as well in order to support themselves and their families. Okay, next. Oh, okay. This is John N. Smith. When we were honoring the veterans, there was a celebration of Abram Galloway and Abram Blunt. This, I believe, was the abolitionist who was born in, I believe he was born in Wilmington, but lived in Southport. You may have to correct me on that, somebody, if you know that. Okay, so that was a celebration held at the cemetery, okay? This is Mary Ann Galloway. Mary Ann Galloway is the sister of Abram Galloway, and she was born in the Royal Oak section of Supply. And she was a washwoman and washed clothes until her death. She lived to be 118 or 19 years, 119 years old. So she was an entrepreneur because she was self-employed. So that, so we certainly honor her and what she did to help her family. But the family connection, of course, is their siblings. Okay? All right, next. This is Sarah Mackenzie Evans, and you may be familiar with the Mackenzie name. In Southport, there is actually a tabletop on Howe Street where the Mackenzies lived at the time, and there are 3 shops. I think there are 3 shops still that exist there. There's a beauty shop now, which used to be the confectionery store or the ice cream place, and Mr. Willie, as we called him when we were kids, Mr. Willie Mackenzie operated that store. It looks pretty much as it did with the wooden, I don't know what those boards are called, but it has wood paneling on the inside. It looks very much like it did when I was a child, and we would go in. The ice cream place and some of the counters were on the left side. We'd go there, and Mr. Willie had these little round chairs with ice cream seats in there, and he was quite a nice man, so he served us there. However, this is his sister, and his sister was a teacher, and she taught in Pine Level, North Carolina. And if I'm not mistaken, the Pine Level where she taught is not too far from Kittrell or Raleigh area. And she was one of the first blacks to receive a pension, and that's one of the reasons we remember her in the Mackenzie family. All right, and next. This is Mr. Willie Mackenzie, who owned the ice cream parlor right on Howe Street. And as I said, there's a flower shop. The ice cream parlor is a beauty salon. The flower shop is next to it. That is owned by the Mackenzies also. And the White House, where they were born, that is still in the Mackenzie family. In the back of the shop was a pool hall. Of course, we weren't allowed to go in there. They did, what they could to protect children, but there was usually a nighttime life in most of the businesses in Southport. There was a daytime for us because we often had little dances and would go by after school, but there was always a nighttime life as well for the adults. So as I said, you can take a look at that on Howe Street. Yes. Okay. Next we have Miss Dolly Evans. Miss Dolly Evans lived right there on Lord Street on the corner of Lord and Leonard. And this is her business on Howe Street, which is where Saucy is now. If you know where Saucy is, that was a 2-story building was erected there. And I remember it as a child. And Miss Dolly had candy and all sorts of things that she sold in her store. Her maiden name was Spalding, so she was related to the Spaldings of Durham that started Mutual. The first black insurance business, banking, it escapes me now, something Mutual, North Carolina Mutual. And they were a part of what was called the Black Wall Street in Durham, North Carolina. She was also married to Robert Evans, who was the first lawyer, from the first black lawyers in Brunswick County. So remember Miss Dolly, yeah. And I'm sure a lot of you, some of you remember Miss Dolly very well. Okay, all right. And I want to say that across the street from Miss Dolly, we had a couple of other businesses. One of the businesses across the street was the Highway Cleaners, and that was run by Dexter Clemens. And Dexter was well known, and well known in our community. And he also, as I said, he ran the Cleaners, but his son and his son's wife became the owners. I'm not sure when Mr. Clemens died, when Dexter Clemens died. I don't have that information. Somebody in the audience might have it. But after he did die, his son and his wife, who is Marjorie Gore and Lorenzo Clemens took over the business. Lorenzo was actually a school teacher, and he taught for a while, but then he came home to help his dad in the Cleaners, and I think he enjoyed that a little bit more at the time that he did school teaching. And even though Dexter and, even though Lorenzo and Marjorie aren't buried in John Smith, that is a family connection. They're in Northwood, but I wanted to share their pictures with you so that you can see them. And unfortunately, Marjorie died a couple of years ago. She's a really sweet woman, really sweet, nice family. Okay, all right, thank you. Next, we have Frank Gordon. Frank Gordon taught school for over 55 years. He was educated by white women. I think he only went to school to maybe the 9th grade, maybe not even then. And even then, he was born a slave. So he was not in school all year as we are now, just periodically. And if I'm not mistaken, there was some teachers at what is the old St. Philip's Church, and I think he went there, as I recall, he went there to receive some of his education. But then he taught all around the county for a number of years. And Judy Gordon, who is one of the president, basically, of the John Smith Cemetery Committee, is his great-granddaughter, or great-great-granddaughter, I'm thinking. Let me look at great-great-granddaughter, I think. Okay, all right. Let's see, Mr. Ricardo. One thing that he did, it is said that he paid someone, and I don't know who the someone is, $5 cents to teach him a new math problem as he was coming up. So he wanted to learn about math, and he paid 5 cents for each new math problem that he learned. Okay? All right. Okay. All right. Next. Okay. This is Ellis Bellamy, and he died in a training accident in World War II. I don't know where he was at camp, but if you are familiar with Bellamy Joyner Lodge Hall, Bellamy Joyner, this is the Bellamy it was named after. As you can see, he was a young man and was killed in an accident. Okay, next. And this is Master Sergeant Joyner. This is the Joyner in the Bellamy Joyner connection. And he was an Army drill instructor, and he was in Southport, went back to camp in Camp Chaffee, Arkansas, and had a goiter. So they did surgery, and he died on the table. And as you can see, he was not that old. So hence we have the Bellamy Joyner Lodge here, which is the, what do you call it? American Legion Hut, as we call it, which is on, what street? 9th Street. Thank you, 9th Street. All right, okay, next. This is Miss Cora Mebane. Miss Mebane was a second grade teacher at what we call Brunswick County Training School, or the school in Southport, which is now Brunswick Community College. She was not from Southport originally, I don't think, but and that's as my mind serves me. But Miss Mebane was quite a musician as well. And she had a group of kids called the Melodiers. There are 4 young girls that sang with the Melodiers. Some of you in the audience might remember that group. And also, let me see if I can find my notes. Okay. She had a group called the Miss Cora's Boys, and they sang around town too. You remember them? Okay, yes. And so they were often invited, to sing at various establishments or, churches, that type of thing. She was quite an avid fisherman, so you'd often see her walking with her hat on, going down to the water to fish. And in one of the 4th of Julys or some competition, it wasn't really a competition, I think you just buy a ticket. She won a car. I remember it was in the Stateport Pilot not too long ago. You remember that? Okay, Andrew remembers. She did win a car. I don't know what happened to the car, but she lived on Lord Street on the corner of Lord and Leonard, and her house is still there today. It has had some changes, but that house is pretty much the same as it used to be, except that they built out on the front. So we have a lot of historical houses dispersed within Southport. Okay, that's Miss Davis. All right. Okay. Next. This is John and Melissa Jackson. Melissa Jackson was a philanthropist, and she was also a fisherman, a shrimper, rather. She had a shrimp boat called the Snapshot, and she employed all of her sons. And so she had a pretty lucrative income because of the shrimping. And she donated the land for what is now Brown's Chapel AMEZ Church. And if you're familiar with Jabbertown Road, that is where Brown's Chapel is. Almost, not quite at the corner, but it's on Jabbertown Road. Okay. And she had quite a bit of land, as I said, and was one of the people that that donated that land to Brown's Chapel. There's also a land for a cemetery there, but that has long passed. There were some people that were buried in that area, but that's long ago. Yes, basically. All right, next. This is Junius Jackson, and Junius Jackson had a church at what was called Mount Missouri or Mount Misery. It depends. You call it Mount Missouri? Mount Missouri. Okay. So that's, and Junius Jackson and Melissa Jackson are siblings. Is that right? I think that's right. Okay. And Mount Missouri, as Emma is telling me, was off of 133 and 211. Near 133 and 211, and that was where Brown's Chapel was, right? Am I? That was near. That's where. Let's see, the Sawdust Trail. Anybody know where the Sawdust Trail is? Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, we call it the Sawdust Trail when we were kids. It's near Jabbertown Road. Yes, where the bank is, up in that area where the bank is, and across the street, because that road was not quite that wide, and I think that's where the train tracks used to come through as well, as I recall, some time ago. So they own quite a bit of land up in there, and that is one of Melissa Jackson's. He was a Buffalo Soldier. I think that's her son, though. I think I'm getting that 29. She was born in 1929. Son. That is her son. Yes, he was one of the ones that was on the shrimp boat, and I think she had 5 sons, as I recall. Okay, and Eunice Jackson was also in the Spanish-American War, and he was with Teddy Roosevelt and Rough Riders, is what I understand. Okay, all right. Yes, Buffalo Soldier. The Buffalo Soldiers, and they were called, let me go back a little bit, they were called Buffalo Soldiers because when they rode together in mass, of course, they were black and reminiscent of buffalo maybe, and the dust also that they kicked up. But they were used to assist in the aid of the American Indians and other various things in the time of the Army, when they were in the Army. I think they assisted with some of the moving toward the reservations and things of that nature as well. Okay? Mm-hmm. But they're all black units. Mm-hmm. Okay. Next. This is Miss Sarah Jane Cotton, and this is Miss Cotton right here. And she lived, her house was recently torn down since I've been back in Southport. It was at the corner of, and it was a nice house, it really was. It was at the corner of Lord Street and Rhett. Blue. I remember it was a blue house. Yeah, pretty large structure. There's a new house there now. But she was one of the founding members of Mount Carmel, what is now Mount Carmel AME Church. And she worked for a judge here who was Judge Craner. And she and Judge Craner or Craner, I'm not sure the exact pronunciation. I think it's Craner, maybe Craner. She worked for the judge, and she and the judge's wife became good friends. So when Gib Davis, who was not Gib Davis. So when Mr. Bing Moore, who was the piano player at Mount Carmel, when he was ill, you guys remember Mr. Bing, huh? You can tell with piano, couldn't he? Yes. When Mr. Bing was sick, the judge's wife would come and play for the church. So they were good friends, and that's just something that we've learned over the years. And that's it about Sister Cotton. And this is a picture in front of old Mount Carmel before they bricked it. And Mount Carmel, in case you didn't know, was actually, the church was actually purchased from St. Philip's. It was St. Philip's old church, and they moved it to the corner of Lord and St. George Street by mule and logs. So until the 70s, as I remember, it was just the wooden church, the wooden structure. And then after the 70s, they bricked it up and things of that nature. But if you're familiar with the area, you'll see that it has the plaque on there, and it says that it is part of St. Philip's Church. St. Philip's. Trinity United. Thank you. Trinity Methodist. Yes. Thank you. Mm-hmm. All right. Next. This is Bud McCoy. Bud McCoy was the local mortician here, and his place of business was right next to Highway Cleaners on Lord Street. So we had, say it again? Howe Street. Thank you. On Howe Street, yes. So we had the Highway Cleaners, Mr. Bud McCoy, the mortician, and he was in the Navy. He retired from the Navy. Initially, there was no embalming. He didn't have the equipment for embalming. So there was a white mortician, Lothrop, I believe it is, who embalmed some of the people for him. And then eventually, Lothrop was bought out by Kilpatrick's. And that funeral home is actually across the street, what is now the Christmas house. Yeah. So that was the funeral home. The Christmas house was the funeral home. So think about that as you buy your candy. Okay. When Mr. McCoy died, I think it's his nephew, Henry Green, who was married to Josie McCoy, hence the name, it became McCoy Green Funeral Home. He operated the funeral home until his death, and then later on, another nephew, I believe, Charles Nelson, purchased the funeral home or came to town and moved here. He had quite a few children, and they operated the business until sometime maybe in the 80s, maybe. Sometime in the 80s. So all of that was on Howe Street. You had highway cleaners, Bud McCoy's, across the street is Dolly Evans, and then the McKenzies. So all of that block now that unfortunately most is pretty much gone. Those were Black businesses, and also those houses where you see Rebecca's and all of that, those were all houses of Black teachers. Just everyone was a school teacher that lived in that section right there. Okay? Okay. This was Sheriff James Edward Clemens Jr., and he, of course, was a native of Southport, but he was the sheriff in Rockingham County, and unfortunately, he died very suddenly, and, quite a shock to the community. His recent funeral was held in 2021. The motorcade from Rockingham to Southport was quite some miles long, and it did not stop until it got in Southport. There is a table out there with some information about him as well, if you take a tour of the cemetery. He was educated in Brunswick County School, South Brunswick, and attended Livingston College. And if you know our past alderman, Nelson Adams, they are siblings. Yes. So, yes. All right. Next. Okay. This is Mr. Herbert Brown. And Mr. Herbert Brown had an establishment called, I want to say the Shop, and it was on Lord Street and Leonard, on the corner of Lord Street and Leonard. There are now some new houses there, but on the way home from school, this was one of the places that we often frequented. As you're walking by, going home from school, you may stop and get a piece of candy at Mr. Herbert Brown's. And he also sold wood, as I recall. He sold wood, and he was one of the Blacks on the Negro Citizen League in the 1940s. In the 1940s, Mr. Herbert Brown, Miss Estelle Swain, and who else was there? Oh, I can't remember. I don't remember the third person right now. Wrote a letter to who was then the superintendent of, they were split up, they were called superintendent of white schools, and then you had the Black schools. So it was Superintendent Newbold. They wrote him a letter, and they were concerned about the Brunswick County Training School, that it was not up to par of the white school in the area. So they formed a committee, and they wrote a letter, as I said, in the 1940s. And that's one of the things that Mr. Herbert Brown is known for, other than being having his own establishment on Lord Street. Okay? Next. This is Miss S.L. Swain. She, too, was an educator in Southport. She taught music, and anybody who ever played a piano was taught by Miss S.L. Swain. I went for a few weeks, and then I told my dad, "You're wasting your time." Same thing, huh? Okay, all right. But you will find that a lot of the musicians in Southport, a little under my age and up, were taught by Miss Estelle Swain. She was also an art teacher in school. I remember her teaching us some how to do certain art projects in school. She was a graduate of Hampton Institute, which is in Hampton, Virginia, now Hampton University. And She was quite a woman. She lived on. In fact, her house is her house is gone because it was a two-story, but it was on what is now Caswell Street, near the park, near Cavanis Park. Yes. Okay. All right. Next. This was Freddie Elmer Smith. Freddie Elmer Smith was a musician and a business owner. He had a store which is also on Caswell Street, but it was it Caswell? Okay. The Bebop Inn. And, I have never been in the Bebop Inn, but I know my dad used to go there. And it really was not for children, as I recall. They played jazz music. I'm sure they drank, had a good time. But it was an establishment really for adults. And he was trained at the Boston Conservatory and but lived his life here in Southport and was quite a musician, as I recall. Next to the Bebop Inn, we also had the Dewdrop Inn. So the young people were at the Dewdrop Inn, and then people like my dad who went to listen to jazz, because that's mostly, I think, what he played was jazz. They were at the Bebop Inn, and he often had some people of note at his place, but we weren't privy to that at the time. Yeah. So I might also mention that his daughter, one of his daughters was, and you might see some articles about her. She's deceased now, unfortunately, a young girl, was a tennis player of some note, and Vanessa. And you might see articles from time to time about her in the Southport paper or other papers. And she used to, so you could see her walking by with her little tennis racket, going to play tennis, and she won a few competitions around here. Quite a nice young lady, but as I said, she died relatively young, a couple of years ago. Okay, all right. Next. This is Harry Parker, and we call him Raphael, Raphael. So Harry Raphael Parker, that's the name that I knew him by. And he is related in some way. He was a Menhaden fisherman, had his own boat, and was the captain of his own boat. His house is still on the corner of all these houses on the corner. Have you noticed that? His house is still on the corner of Leonard and Caswell. Leonard and Caswell Street. His daughter lived there. Is that his daughter? Let's see. Until the time of her death, which was in recent years. Okay? All right, next. This is Ralph Parker Sr., but we just saw his dad because he has a son, Ralphie. We call him Ralphie, but he's Ralph, maybe a junior. And coming up in school, we called him Bidu. And I don't know if that was because of his musical inclination and all of that, but he was quite a musician. He finished at A&T and then became a teacher and taught at what BCT, before integration happened. But Ralph ended up being at UNCW, and he was in charge of the Black Studies, or the Minority Affairs at the university. Unfortunately, he too died relatively young, kind of sudden. And that's what we know about Bidu. Yes, okay. What is his name?
It was like 7 years ago,
Yes, it's pretty recent, and he has a tabletop as well at the cemetery. And he was also honored with the Walter Welch Award, as I remember. If you're familiar with Walter Welch, one of the ministers at, I want to say, St. Philip's. Yes. And he was a recipient of that award. It's some years ago. Okay. Next. This is James Clemens. Mr. Clemens was the principal at Lincoln High School. And Lincoln is actually in Leland, North Carolina, but it's also a part of Brunswick County. If you're not familiar with Brunswick County, it is the biggest in land area county in North Carolina. It was, in the early days, it was known as the largest and the poorest. That's how we remember Brunswick County. Lots of land with farming, lots of farmers and not much else. So Mr. Clemens, as I said, was the principal of Lincoln until his death, as far as I know. He lived in Southport and eventually did move to the Leland area. He had a son that we called Cookie Clemens that finished at Wake Forest. I think Cookie is deceased as well. And yes, so his mother was had an establishment on Lord Street, right across from the school. It's a 2-story building where she sold candy and such at the bottom. And the house that they lived in still exists. It is on the corner, once again, not quite the corner. It's right next door to
Church.
Yes. First Baptist Church, the little white house next to First Baptist Church. You can tell it's not one of the tall ones. That is where they lived. And next door was was their store. So that's Mr. Clemens. Mm-hmm. Next. Mm-hmm. This is Alexander Gore. Alexander Gore is my grandfather. He was, I didn't even write any notes, so I guess, oh gosh. He was a member of Mount Carmel AME Church. And at the time of his death, he was what do you call it? He was on the board of the black schools, a black school rather. He was a board member of the Brunswick County Training School, or BCT, at the time of his death. The house is still in existence on Lord Street, and it was built in 1923. And that's Alexander Gore. All right, next. Alexander Gore's son, next. Was my dad. My dad was the assistant principal at Lincoln Elementary School with James Clemens. They're actually cousins. Clemens and Gores are usually related in some way. This is the day that my mother and father got married. They were in New York. My dad was in the Army. He was in school at North Carolina College, and in those days they pulled you out of school to serve. So he served in the Army, and then he returned to school and finished his degree at A&T, what is now A&T University. It was A&T State in Greensboro, North Carolina. At the time of, before my dad died, after becoming the assistant principal at Lincoln, he was also at what was called, when integration happened, Leland High School. And then eventually he went to the Board of Education. He was a supervisor of schools in science. Okay, next. This is my uncle Nehi. That's my dad's brother. So my grandparents had 11 children. So Uncle Nehi, who is also known as the Gentle Giant, was one of those children. And on this picture, we have Uncle Nehi, who is actually Elias Gerthel Gore, my Aunt Babby, as we called her, who is Maverick Gore, and my Uncle Mackey, who was John Moore Gore. Okay, so those are three of the siblings standing in front of the house on Lord Street. In 1942, the house actually burned, so it was rebuilt again. I don't think it didn't burn totally down, but there was some damage. And this picture you've probably seen in the Maritime Museum of Uncle Nehi standing next to what was a markup of one of the fishing boats that he worked on. He also went to New York to model at one point, but I had a letter, and I can't put my hands on now. He did not like it. He didn't enjoy it. He said that he felt like he was on display, so he didn't stay long, and he wanted to come home. So that's what he did. Next. I think that's it. I hope I've shown you some of the family connections of people in Southport. We often say that we don't want to delve too deeply because as some people say, we are all related, and we think that many of us are, so as you look at the names in Southport, you'll see that there's certain names that come up time and time again. Even though there are three sets of Gores in Southport, we deny kinship. But there are actually, Mr. Origo's family was from Longwood. And so, that was a long way to travel when my mother was even young. She talked about how Ralph, or Bidu's father, would take her sometimes to see her parents, which lived in Northwest North Carolina, which is not that far from Leland, but it was a long trip. It was quite a trip. So that's why we say we're not really related, but we won't know until we delve a little deeper. Thank you. Thank you.